everyone. My name is Nitya. I'm from Team Belong. The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and a library for inclusive literature. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now, on to today's session. This session is on children as agents, the politics of childhood, with Rinchin, Ameya Narvankar, Raakhee Mirchandani, and Nina Sabnani. The session will be moderated by Shranya Gambhir. Shranya has a BA in English and Journalism from Ashoka University. Most recently, she was a fellow with Teach for India, where she taught children on issues of gender and prejudice.
Thanks, Nitya. Thank you all for being here today. I'm just going to begin by introducing you so that everybody knows the amazing work that you're doing. So I'll just start by introducing everyone. So let's begin with Nina. Nina Sabnani is an artist and storyteller who uses film, illustration, and writing to tell her stories. Nina's research interests include exploring the dynamics between words and images in storytelling. She has written and illustrated several books for Tilika, and her award-winning films, Mukund and Riyaz, The Stitches Speak, and Remake Images have been made into illustrated books and translated in several Indian languages. In 2018, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award for illustration from Tata Trust at the Tata Lit Live Fest at Mumbai. Nina is currently professor of the Industrial Design Center at IIT Mumbai. Thank you for being here, Nina. Moving on to Raakhee. Raakhee Mirchandani is an award-winning journalist and author. Currently, she is the editorial director for diversity and inclusion at Dow Jones. Previously, she was a columnist at the New York Post and managing editor at the New York Daily News. Raakhee is also the author of Super Satya Saves the Day. Her book Hair Twins, releasing in 2021, is about the special bond between a Sikh father and daughter. Raakhee serves as the president of the board for Tomorrow's Children Fund, a 35-year-old pediatric cancer charity. Thank you for joining us, Raakhee.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on to Ameya. Ameya Narvankar is a multidisciplinary designer, storyteller, and visual artist from India. He is an alumnus of Industrial Design Center at IIT Bombay and has always believed in design for change. And with his first published children's book as an author and an illustrator, he hopes that Ritu Weds Chandni will not only have a positive impact on society, but also win their hearts. He is fond of cats, houseplants, baking, and DIY crafts. Moving on to Rinchin. There's some common interests there.
Yes.
Moving on to Rinchin. Rinchin is a writer and an activist based in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. Her writing for children reflects her social engagement with several people's movements for the past 2 decades. Some of her books are Sabri's Colors, The Magical Fish, Trickster Bird, and I Will Save My Land. She also has 3 short story collections. Of them are Tree of Stories, Ajuba, Churel Ka Nashta, all published by Tilika and Eklavya. Thank you for being here today. Okay, great. So I'm really happy to have you all here today. I've been going over your work for the last few days, and of course in the months that I've been in touch with you all. And I'm so glad and grateful that work like this is being done, especially as a former teacher. And so I'll begin by talking about that actually, because that's when this crisis in children's literature, came to my attention. So while teaching kids and while trying to find stories, especially for children who were from a very different background than I was, I realized that there were very few books that were actually entry points into their lives. And very few of them actually understood the context that they came from and what their daily struggles looked like, or what just their life looked like, in fact. So it was a huge struggle to find good books for them, and not only in terms of representation, but also in terms of what are you teaching a kid through this book? What does it look like? What is the message you're giving? How is gender being presented? Which is something really close to my heart. And sometimes that would come down to like writing books yourself. Even though I'm not a writer, as much as I like to be, but it came down to trying to include everyone in the classroom. And I realized the simple abstract subjects that were very common for me, or like my, the privileged school and upbringing that I've had, were very alien to them. Just the concept of friendship, for example. I got to go out and meet my friends, but for most of my students, going out and meeting friends was not a concept that had ever existed, right? So when I'm trying to teach kids who are already very far behind with their academic rigor and their level, how do I, in the midst of all of this, when I'm trying to teach them, how do I give them a book which doesn't even make sense to them? When I'm reading something out to them, when an exam is going on, I have students coming and telling me, what does a pancake mean, Didi? Like, what are these things? I've never seen one. I don't know what these things mean and what are these concepts. What does it mean to have a phone where you talk to your friends on? And so you cannot expect a child to learn through books which don't make sense, right? And which especially are not grounded in their reality. And then what happens is you begin to blame the child for not learning, which is the biggest crisis of them all. And it is such a huge problem which goes unnoticed. So before I say any more, because there are so many experiences I've had with books, I really want to, give you guys a platform to talk about the kind of work that you do. But to begin with, I want to, in many ways, all of you are not only looking at representation as children as agents, but you're also addressing a problem of representation, right? In so many ways, whether it is with brown kids, whether it is with the LGBT community, whether it is with identity, or what you do, Rinchin, which is so interesting with activism. It's a lot of different fields, right? So let's talk about why children's book should extend beyond the usual fairy lands and fantasy and explore different realities.
Yeah, I think Shranya, from what you were saying, I think the issue always, it's about representation, and it's not so much about fantasy and reality or whatever. I think to a large extent, it's about perspective. And it's also about the context from where these stories are coming from, who's telling these stories, and what kind of mindset or even what kind of perspective these stories are coming from. I think our problem is with that, because when we were growing up, I think a lot of us were reading inadvertents, and we had no idea what scones were or what potted meat was, but we read them. And I think, children, one would not have a problem with not knowing something that you're reading about, but it is more about how that makes you feel and what that says about your culture. So when I read about another culture, or I read about another context of people, it is not the fact that those people are alien to me, because literature is what brings alien things to life in my reality. Things that I cannot see, literature will allow me to see. It will allow me to grapple with complex realities far away from me, but it is also about how it makes me feel. Do I feel bad that I am not that child that is always represented in those stories? Do I feel that my reality does not exist? And does it amplify my voice in my own head, or does it make me then want to be someone else, or always be aspirational, or always feel invisible? So whether you're queer, whether you're Adivasi, whether it's the issue of caste that is never discussed in children's literature, but which is a reality in many children's lives, whether it's the work that their parents do, because stories do not glorify that kind of work. Stories do not give dignity to those lives. So I think the issue is more about the perspective from which stories are written about. And very recently, I think someone was talking about the fact that most stories, we also don't always have to write about not our own realities, but whichever reality we write about, that it's the perspective and the position that we are writing from, which I think is very important, and which is something that as growing up for children, it is important for each of us to have affirmative things about our lives and to see ourselves in the larger framework in which we read our story.
What Rinchin has, raised, and so did you actually when you introduced, your own work. And it's true that when we were growing up as children, we didn't know. I read a lot of Russian fairy tales. They were cheap, so they were largely available, and so you could have lots of them because. And then we also read Archie comics and things like which have made no sense at all. But because it wasn't about me in any case, it didn't alienate me as much as when you have a book about your own culture in which you are not represented, in which you are invisible or in which you are absent, So when I was doing the book, my home book, that was one thing that I wanted to address is that usually when you think of a family, you just think of, it's a very normative, a normative family is, father, mother, brother, sister, and, and maybe a pet or something. And then it's all the roles are also very clear, like a mother is cooking, father is reading a newspaper, and these things, they don't even look wrong, to people. Even those who are drawing, when I teach illustration, my students, sometimes I give them an assignment just to see what, things are embedded, have been assimilated in your psyche that you're not even aware that you are not being inclusive, So these things seem so trivial, and when you say to somebody, but why is this woman why is she cooking? Why are you showing her cooking? Mothers cook. These are stereotypes, and these things get kind of the status quo is kind of maintained, and it's maintained not in the saying bad things about it. It's just representing them in a way that everyone is supposed to believe it, that that's how it is. So it doesn't question the status quo. So I think that is something that would bother, say, if you saw an illustration of a home, of a house, and it's some fancy house, But I don't live in a fancy house. I live in a pipe. Then how do I even connect to this house? And how do I know that it is about me? The name sounds like it could be my name, It's an Indian name. It's something I could recall that maybe I'm called that name, but it's not my house. It's not my family. I don't live with mother, father. I live, with an aunt or something, or I live in an orphanage. You know what I mean? So those are the things that are lost, those are not sort of things. And these are the things that as authors, publishers, even as illustrators, we have to, be a little alert on, because I think without realizing, you are actually projecting a kind of a way to look at how things are represented.
I think, Nina, you brought up, or Rinchin, you brought up Enid Blyton. So I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in America. My parents are from India. And so I read a ton of Enid Blytons growing up. And I remember clearly being stuck on what's a treacle tart and what is lacrosse? This is so far removed from my reality as an Indian child in northern New Jersey. And I didn't question it much, but I knew that it was not for me at all. And I read it. And until I watched Bend It Like Beckham in college, did I know what it was to feel represented in art. I must have been 19 years old, right? I'm in Boston. We go to an independent movie theater, and all of a sudden it's there we are, splashed on the screen. And I will never forget that feeling of feeling not just seen, but represented and then accepted and loved by all the folks, right? Who didn't love that movie? And so I majored in journalism, and I became a writer, and I became a journalist. And it wasn't until I had my daughter, Satya, that the bookshelf looked real different to me when I went out to buy books for her. And she is a superhero kind of obsessed child. And she really loved Wonder Woman. And I was I'm going to grab a book for her where there's a brown girl on the cover who's dressed like a superhero. We lived just a couple of blocks from a bookstore. I went down there. There were 0 books. I went to libraries, 0 books. I went on Amazon. They have everything, 0 books. And I was furious, like angry, because I grew up like that. There was no way that I was going to allow this child to grow up like that. To not see herself represented on a cover of a book, to not see her father, right, a man in a turban, represented on a cover of a book. And so it really forced me to think about what was missing. And what was missing was our story. Like, we were missing. We have been missing for so long from these books, from children's books. And so when I wrote Super Satya, and my husband looked at the cover and he was like, they're gonna use the man with a turban on the cover? I mean, we're, at that point, we were like 36 years old. And for that to feel so foreign and so not possible is painful. And so it was just interesting, right? Like, they're set in a city. The dad does all of like the parenting in the book. That is on purpose. Like, the burden of parenting in children's books has always been placed on mothers and grandmothers. And my next book, also Hair Twins, is about, a sick father and daughter and sort of their hair ritual together. And there's no mom in that book. And that's on purpose, right? Because there are plenty of ways that our families look. And for me, the main thing was that our children see themselves as everyday heroes, as superheroes, but also that the world sees our men, strong brown men, as good fathers, as the kind of man that you want to be with. Like, that is really important to me. And so that's sort of how I set out on this journey of writing for children. And it doesn't go unnoticed, because I do tons of schools and school visits, and every single time, there will be a small brown child in that audience who will raise their hand and be like, Raakhee, are you Indian? Every time. And it's like, yeah. And then they'll be like, oh, me too. Because that is, it doesn't happen all the time. I know that feeling. That's how I felt when I watched Bend It Like Beckham. I said, me too. That's me too.
Thank you for sharing, Raakhee. Those are really, really important stories. Ameya?
Yeah. So children's literature, I feel, is like the first introduction of kids to the outside world. Like, apart from observing their parents, like, the kid would be first introduced to their surroundings through books.
Yeah.
And as you guys said, even I grew up on the staple of Nancy Drew, Famous Five, Secret Seven, all of those books. And yes, it did leave me wondering, where was I? I couldn't find myself in any of those books I read. And as I grew up, I was like, okay, this is not something that I aspire to be like. So this probably, I think, has led to me writing Ritu at Shani. Like, as I grew up, I sort of tried to otherize. I came out as a gay man much later in my life. As a kid, because I couldn't see any of those, like, those roles in books or anything I read or something I saw on television or in films, I thought, no, this is not right. This isn't what I should be. So that led me to otherizing my own identity and sort of suppressing it for a while. But as I grew up and, like, reading more about, so many of you have written more inspirational stuff, definitely that helped. And probably at a much later age, I peaked and I had the courage to come out. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Ameya. All of you shared such interesting things, and there's so much to build on. But what really stands out, and that's something Ameya mentioned, is that all of you also do different things. Apart from just writing, for children, there are other things that you do. And so I just want to understand, why do you choose the medium of storytelling? Why do you choose the medium of fiction in specific? There could also be a class in school about a lot of these subjects. It could just be the first thing they do in the morning. So what is it specifically about storytelling, reading, and fiction for children that draws you to it? And Nina, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I think stories are the primary ways by which we make sense of the world, and it's only through stories, because anything else that is given to you as it's data, any generic information, it's here and it's gone. That's it, and especially when you're a kid, the only way you can express yourself and also understand something else is through the story, because like, say, if a child is unhappy, not say I'm unhappy, The child will say, my mother didn't feed me today. You know, it's that way of expressing that they are worried, you know. So it's always through an event or something. Because that kind of abstraction comes much later in life, you know. Even for adults, I think a lot of things that you know, you make sense of, or which stay with you for the longest time, is because they were delivered to you through a story, you know, because there is, in the story, there is a particularization, you know, you can identify with the character. If you have a paper, you know, you understand it intellectually, but you do not connect with it in the same way, you know. You identify with the character. You feel the emotion, you know. So, and with that, you know, whatever needs to be, you know, therefore shared and told, then it you know, like when I made that book called Mukun and Diaz, which is about partition and how, you know, people were separated. I mean, my father told me, you know, like everybody talks about leaving behind property, but I left my best friend behind. And that really, you know, it like something went, you know, like a gulp, you know, when I heard him say this, because you know, you tend to see your father as his father, you know, he's all figured out, he knows what's what, and he has answers for you, you know, he's the one who sort of pulls you out. But here was this man, you know, wanting someone to ask him, you know, and tell about his childhood and, you know, tell his story. And I think the way, you know, it doesn't matter who, you know, this happened so many years ago, but and so many children today never even know about. I mean, even I didn't experience the partition. You know, I've only been what you call I have borrowed memories, or, you know, like inherited memories of my parents, you know, like you know, being you know, facing that separation and that loss and stuff like that. But people know what it means to be separated. People understand what it is to feel loss, you know. So it doesn't matter, you know, from which era, which region, which country, you know, but as long as that emotion of that loss and that separation is experienced, you know, you understand it, you know. And children understand this even better. I mean, the kind of questions they ask me, it is like you know, I can be in a webinar, ask me any questions. Don't put me in a school with these kids. But God, the kind of question they ask, I'm like, oh gosh, I lose my tongue, because they ask very, very important questions.
Yeah,
so stories really, like, you know, they get it.
Yeah, very true. Ameya?
Yes. Storytelling, I feel, has the ability to transport you to a different period or place, as Neena ma'am definitely said. And they can make an impact on a child's life, which definitely, like, you know, changes and shapes and molds their minds as they grow up. They try and see people around them, empathize with them through these stories.
Yeah, I think stories allow you space to think beyond what is happening and what you're told, what is supposed to happen. So I think literature for all of us, whether it's children or for adults, it's a place where you can sort of refine your thought, where you can think through things, where you can get inspired, where you can, you know, literature is something that, I mean, sometimes you read a story that is very much like your life and it still gives you something, and you read something that is unlike you, but it gives you something. So again, it's because it's always existed in every reality, in every time, in every era. So it has its own purpose. And I think that's why stories are important for us to figure out our lives. It informs us, it also reinforces, because I think as a woman, as a person who, I think I sort of like all the characters, like if someone asked me who are the inspirational people in your life, I would probably name people from literature. I mean, people inhabiting stories are the people that I always would think of. Yeah, I want to be that person, or I relate to this person. So that's it. And I think stories, you don't decide sometimes. For me, at least, one doesn't decide that one wants to write a story or why you choose to. I think the story chooses you. And from whatever that you're doing, there are times that, because for me, it's not even like I don't even have an allotted time for writing, or that I for a long time, I didn't even call myself a writer, but sometimes there's an urge that you feel that it needs to be put down on paper, and something needs to be put down, like some reasons that you see, someone that you meet, and you feel that it comes up as a story. So that's it. And that's why I think a lot of people would write like that. That is it, because there's a compulsion to tell those stories. So yeah, I mean, both for why they're written and also what they do to us. I would think that it's an important part of how we see the world and how we see our lives.
Yeah.
Stories explain ourselves to us sometimes. And that's why it's so important that all kinds of stories, that we have all kinds of stories representing all kinds of people as much as we can. And those voices need to be amplified. So.
Yeah. That's so true. So yesterday we were having a session on children and innocence, and one of the panelists there said that when I write, I think that stories heal me. And he was writing about war, and it was so interesting to think about how real that is, and how the process of writing is so cathartic as much as it is reading those stories. Raakhee, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think that stories, especially in the context of children and picture books, right, they create an opportunity for connection. So there's connection in the classroom, between peers, between teacher and student. There's connection at home. That story time before bed is a sacred space. You are literally, after the day, and when you are too busy to do anything else, you have this 20 minutes of your child and you're sitting together reading a book. Like, that is precious time. And so what you allow in at that time is important, and it matters. And so it creates connection between parent and child, between parents. And I think we also get a little bit of a do-over, with thinking about how we grew up and what we grew up believing. And is that what we're going to pass on to our kids, or are we going to create a new reality together and question the things that we were told as children that no longer fit the reality that we live in or the world that we want to live in? And so I think there's this real opportunity for connection. And just to be super clear, although I think it's very clear to all of you, these books are for our children, but they're for all the children. It is really important that all the children see the brown kids and the brown families as worthy, as worthwhile, as worth spending time with, as smart, as strong, as funny, right? As good parents, as adventurous. And so it's not like I'm setting out to write books only for, brown children. That is absolutely not the case at all. These are for all the kids. In the same way that, my daughter, she loves to read Last Stop on Market Street, right? Because it's a window in to your neighbor.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's so true also, like, the word brown here can mean anything. It can be any stories from all over India, for example, all over the world. The global exchange of it has to be so much more equal for all kids to be informed about their world and what exists out there. And so the third question I want to get to actually is that another thing that's common between you four is that you're putting down very complex thoughts onto paper for students or for children to read. And so what is your process of writing and breaking down complex ideas into simpler forms for children to understand? And adding to that, should children's literature be sanitized? Are there things that you censor yourself while writing for children? Do you self-censor? Do you monitor yourself? What is the process of doing this like? And I'd like to start with Nina again, if that's okay, actually.
Yeah, sure.
I promise not to begin with you after this.
Okay. No, I hope not completely. Yeah, I think, see, I am an animator also. I make animated films. So that itself requires a certain degree of, telling a story in a very different way. And it doesn't mean that it's simplistic, there are very complex ideas that you want to communicate, and but you have that short time in which you have to say it. So a lot of my books actually are first films, and then from films they become books. So a lot of research goes into, you know, the making of the film, because film is, you know, more a sort of, how shall I say, it's very sensorial, you know. It can make you cry, you feel something shiver, go down your spine, you know. I mean, there is all sorts of things that happen. So, and of course, when you make that into a book, there's a big transition also that happens, you know, when you're doing that. But sorry, what was the question?
Should children's books or the things that you're talking about in children's books or films, like you said, should they be sanitized? Are there things that children should not be reading
Whether
about?
we do some self censorship. Yeah, well, you never make a book by yourself. You are always working with a publisher, you know. And I'm very happy that today we have publishers are very you know, enlightened beings, you know. I mean, they really are. They sometimes, you know, they push things in, you know. If I do something, they'll point out and they say, well, you know, this could mean this. So that's, in fact, if there is this a reverse censorship that comes, you know, from the publisher, which is excellent. And the kind of censorship that we do, I mean, we have long conversations about it. It's not like, oh, we can't show this. So there was a story that I'm giving it as an example because, you know, that it makes sense what I'm saying. So there was a film I made. It's called Baat Wahi Hai, which means it's the same story. And basically what I wanted to show that there is no one story. There is no one original and then there are versions of it. But there are multiple stories because they project multiple perspectives. Like Rinchin said earlier, you know, whose perspective, whose point of view, who's looking at it from which location, where have they located themselves and how are they looking at it. So I was doing my research on these storytellers in Rajasthan. And, you know, every time one guy told a story, the other guy said, Mera alag hai. So then the other guy would listen and think, but baat wahi hai. You know, so that's why I called it Baat Wahi Hai. And the film is, you know, like taking actually this, you know, this bantering between two storytellers, which goes back and forth. So now my publisher was very excited and let's do it, you know. But the thing was that in the film, they are telling the story about Shravan Kumar and the way he was born. He's born by, you know, his mother, you know, urinating somewhere. And, you know, that drop goes and falls on some Rishi Muni and then he, so, you know, she gets pregnant because a vine grows out of his navel and it goes all the way up to where she lives. And then because she smells a flower, she gets pregnant. Now, making this for a children's book was, you know, like, should we or, you know, so, but the logic was that, you know, you don't become pregnant by smelling a flower. So now if we can't do that, then the whole basis of that story is gone because I also have to be true to the narratives told to me by the storyteller. I cannot, you know, appropriate it and do what the hell I want with it. So we took another story. But we took the same, we told the story, and also told by the same two storytellers about why is Ganesha worshipped first before any, you know. So, but it's a lovely, you know, take on the. But we had to do that kind of censorship. It was necessary because it would give you know, wrong information. So while you do anticipate fantasy, you do sort of appreciate, you know, that you know, to let your imagination go, but you also are committed, you know, to the kind of things that they will grow up thinking. It's like, you know, people used to think that if people just got married, they had children. They didn't know what the hell it was all about. So we have to be responsible in that sense also into what we are communicating. And I think the publishers and you together, you know, you arrive at that kind of response.
Thank you. Ameya?
So yeah, so children do see themselves in these stories. So I feel like having some sense of familiarity or a relatability factor definitely helps in bringing out these complex ideas. So in my story, I played on having the whole big fat desi wedding as like the background for my story. Like kids are familiar, they go to weddings at like a really young age. So I wanted to have that in, so the children would get some sense of relatability, put themselves in that situation and see how they would react to it in a similar way that my protagonist Aisha does to it.
Yeah.
So I guess that definitely plays in. And yes, as Neena ma'am mentioned, like publishers definitely help in pivoting you or guiding you towards a certain path. Yeah, that will definitely.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like when you are introducing a new idea, how do you do it in a way that also draws them into the story? Because it
You try
can't.
and build, yeah.
Yeah,
You
no,
try
go
and
on.
build some sort of personal connection with the child. So you set that groundwork, okay, and then you take
Yeah,
it forward. You want to explain the idea in detail.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Rinchin, I wanted to bring in you here because all of your books specifically are dealing with very complex ideas and they're happening in the background. Like you do it so skillfully, that you wouldn't even. It's such an interesting story for a child, but there's also in the background, there is a lot of information and education happening at the same time. So if you could actually take an example of any of your books, literally any of them would be brilliant here. How do you do that so well? For example, with I Will Save My Land, for instance.
So I was thinking that actually not much, I don't know, there's not much thought or effort in what you say, in doing what you were describing now, because actually it just it talks about a reality, and it talks about, I mean, I'm sort of living that reality now, and interacting with children who I live with or who live across my house, or people that children who are seeing this every day. So it's because when a child comes in, I mean, the character, whoever the character or the protagonist of the story is, they bring all the issues with them. I mean, these characters also don't come out of thin air, and so everything that is in their life comes with them, and like we would all bring in our lives and our realities with us. Sorry for the cat, but
Love it.
Cat.
Rinchin, sorry to cut you off. Could you actually tell everyone what I Will Save My Land is about?
okay, so I Will Save My Land is about a little girl who it's about a girl who lives with her family, her grandmother and her father, and she is looking. There's some sort of, I mean, she works with her family in her fields, and she is very eager to have, because as a child they feel that she does things which spoils the crops, or she's too young to be messing around in the field, and she wants to be an adult and she wants to do all these adult things, so she wants a piece of her own land. And so that is what this is the kind of play that happens in any family. I want my plate, I want, like, मेरे को भी मेरा खेत चाहिए, मुझे मेरी जगह दे दो. It was also something I remember my mother doing for me in a kitchen garden, like saying that, okay, grow your own coriander, because you wanted to what a child can do and how happy you feel. So this is this child, and she wants to do that. So while she's fighting for her, she wants this small plot of land within the family plot of land. There's also the backstory of her grandmother, who is not upper caste, who has had to fight for land, because largely the Dalits and the Adivasis with no land own very little land in the villages. And so there is another struggle of her grandmother keeping the land that she had from the upper caste people, and now having this land, and in that this young child wanting her plot. And then there is this larger thing of that land being taken over by a mining company. So this child is fighting for her land. When she gets that land within her distinct, she hears that the village is there's a mining company coming, and her parents and which would be normal for a child in that area to be going with their parents to say a dharna or a rally or to a meeting where people are discussing this. So while as adults we are all discussing this, children are there in the background and they're hearing it and they know what's happening. So not that they're included in those discussions, but they know. So it has these 3-4 things going on parallelly, like it happens with any child, right? When you're like, and so in that sense, it doesn't seem very complex because that's the reality. Like my parents are getting posted to some place. I have to have my dinner plus I have a exam. That would be like what a middle class child would be thinking. So this is the reality of this young girl, and and her struggle and her fear about this company now coming and taking the land which she has now got, and how she loves that land, how her grandmother loves that land. So that's how all these, because when it's happening, when the story is being written, it's not being thought of like that. These are not the layers that one is thinking, let's add another layer, let's add another layer. This is how the story comes. What you do later is refine it or clean it or sort of like, when it's too verbose, try to like make more things unsaid than said. You know, in a story, the less the narrator is speaking, the better it is. So that is what one does later. But when it comes out, I think it comes with all these layers because each character that comes in will bring their life with that. So if you're writing a story in that place, you cannot not talk about, say, if you're writing in a village in Chhattisgarh, you cannot talk about not talk about corporate land grab or or the caste system, not just in Chhattisgarh, but everywhere in India. If you're writing a story, I mean, because it's invisible, we don't see it, but then caste exists in every day of our lives. Even for middle class children, I mean, the person who comes and takes the kachra every day from the house, but it's invisible, it's not looked at, but can they come in, can they not come in, what kind of untouchability is practiced. So I think once you start writing about a character, they'll bring in. So I don't know if it answers your question.
No, it answers my question brilliantly, in fact, because I think that's where the idea of representation comes in. What's so simple to you, I mean, what's so simple in the way you've written it, and you say that you're not thinking of these layers, but to someone else who's not sort of in the midst of it, for them, it is actually very masterfully done. I've gone through a lot of your writing, and I think it is really brilliantly done, where you read the book and it's really fun to read, but you've also been educated about a lot of things that, as you said, are invisible otherwise. If I'm sitting in where I grew up in Delhi, I didn't have to think about someone stealing my land, right? So that, for me, that's a very, very different concept. And as for a child to read that, I think that is why these books are so important. So thank you for writing those and for sharing the way you do them. Now I want to bring you in, Raakhee, and I want to talk about, so you wrote Super Satya because you felt a need for this book, but you hadn't written these books before. And so what was your experience of writing it? And I read that you said that you actually just wrote it for your daughter. Yeah. And then you decided to meet with the publisher, and then Mango and Marigold happened, and that's how the book became accessible to other kids. So what was that process of first writing for your own child? And then did you have to change a lot of it so that it was applicable for more children? What was that whole process like?
There's not a lot of pressure when you're writing for a kid who lives in your house. I'll tell you that, because I named the character after her. I'm a longtime journalist. So I was like, I can write this. I had a real fire in my belly after I went to the bookstore and I went to the library. I was like pretty angry and pretty sad. And so I just kind of, on the way to work, I wrote it on my iPhone, and then it didn't take very long. And I printed it out and I read it to her, and unsurprisingly, she loved it, right? But she loved it because I'm her mother and I wrote it for her, but also I named the character after her. There was no reality where Satya was going to go to a bookstore and find a character named Satya, in the same way that Raakhee was never going to find a character named Raakhee. So I was aware of that in the moment, and I didn't really think a lot of it, but she asked for it a few times. And so when she had some friends come by, I sort of just was like, well, this is a good little test audience. Like, let me give it a read here. And they also loved it. And so it occurred, at that point, I was like, there's probably something more to this. I'll reach out to an agent and I'll see how this all goes down. But the truth is that I didn't want to wait I wanted the book to be in a bookstore before Satya turned 5. And at that point, she was just going to be 4. And traditional publishing takes a long time. It's delightful. I'm currently, in that sort of cycle with Little Brown for my next book, and it's delightful. But I needed Super Satya to be in the world before Satya was able to independently read, and I knew that. So I was writing a column for Elle at the time, a parenting column, and so I reached out to Mango and Marigold Press, which is a independent publisher in Boston. And I had liked a couple of the books they had done. And so I just sort of was like, hey, want to take a look at this? And before the weekend was out, they were like, we'll have this book in the stores before she turns 5. We promised you that. And it went through some edits. And look, there are things that always need to be changed. I'm a longtime newspaper editor. I know that I'm not particularly precious about the words. I'm precious about the idea. And so I was very happy to go through the editing process, for the book. But I had a similar experience for Hair Twins too, though. Like I'm aware that there are not a lot of books where there are sick fathers fathering. There just aren't. They don't exist, right? And maybe it's because we're new here a little bit, and I get that. But I wasn't going to wait for someone else to tell that story either. And so, as I went through the process with Little Brown, it was very similar in the sense that the edits are the edits, and I welcome them, and there's so much room for refining, as Rinchin said, that makes plenty of sense. But it was exciting to be able to take it from a thing that happened in my home to a story that will happen in so many homes. There's something really delightful and magical about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And actually that brings me to my next question, and which is that what is you're writing about complex issues which are not usually written about in children's books as a certain standard or certain thing that people look for out of children's books. And so what has been your experience with publishing, and who are the gatekeepers that you've had to sort of cross to get your books into the right hands? And I actually want to begin with Ameya, because you wrote your book in 2016, if I'm not wrong, right?
Yes,
and it publishes now in 2020. And so what has that experience been like for you?
It actually, the book was an outcome of my college project at IDC. Nina ma'am was one of my mentors during that time. Just heads up. So it was an outcome of that. And I had no clue how the publishing world works in India or outside. So I wasn't sure how to go about approaching it. So I think I first started approaching publishing houses after I graduated. So it was at 2016 is when I first sent out my manuscript. So I had my illustrations and the manuscript both. So I've illustrated the book as well. So I sent it across to Indian publishing houses. They take a long time to respond. And they were like really polite, and they said, yeah, this is a book and the story needs to be told. But no one was willing to publish it. And at that time, the law was still back in place. The 2014 judgment had recriminalized homosexuality. So I guess that was one of the reasons a lot of publishing houses didn't want to take up a book like this. That's when I was really fortunate enough to come across Yali Books. They do Southeast Asian literature, so I thought it would fit in really well with them. And I sent my manuscript across, and it was a positive response. And I was like, okay, maybe the Indian audience is not ready for my book, but maybe I can just get it out there, and slowly it can work its way in here as well.
Yeah.
And so maybe right now, after the 2018 judgment, many of these publishing houses might have had a different opinion. They could have, And I'm hoping this would pave way for more books to be written in the same genre. I think there has to be a start from some point.
Yeah. And these are sort of the politics of childhood, right? I mean, the politics and the situations around us determine what the kids get to read. And so that's what, Nina?
Fortunately for me, I've not experienced any gatekeeping in terms of having my work published, because really I've been lucky, because I have a very how should I say, a very enlightened publisher who absolutely loves everything I do. So anytime I have a brainwave and I set them some idea, they say, "Oh, let's do it." So it's never been that way. I mean, well, sorry,
Yeah.
but I didn't have such problems, even though there were, there were issues that I wanted to talk about and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think that gatekeeping is not only with publishing,
Yeah,
it's also with reviewers, for instance, people who will review the books. There was one reviewer who refused to review a book of mine because she said, "You are showing a dead child. You cannot show a dead baby. I'll not review your book." I said, "Don't review," because thing is, I'm not depending on illustration doesn't pay the bills, and anytime you write books, you illustrate books, unless you're some superhero writer, you can't make a living, from this. You have to do other things. You have a proper job, which pays the bills. So I wasn't worried about that. But the thing is that reviewers, librarians will buy the book, not buy the book. Parents, people, adults who gift books to children. These are the gatekeepers,
Yeah.
Publishers, I think more or less, my experience, looking at Pratham, looking at, Tulika, looking at so many other publishers, they're very actually quite, in the sense, quite progressive. They really want to, bring these issues out. Eklavya, for example. There are lots of, lots of publishers that we know of, that address the difficult topics, But it's also like I attended a workshop run by Sujata Norona of Bookworm, Goa. She has an amazing understanding of children's publishing around the world, and she runs these libraries. They're just amazing. She has a library in Goa, and then there's this mobile library. They take them to children or remote places, and she has a huge collection. She does workshops for librarians because in India, librarians are trained. The kind of curriculum they have. They only learn about cataloging and categorizing and blah blah blah. But nobody tells them about, there's no course even, there's no even a module on, how do you source books and what are those books, why would you like to have certain books, especially when it comes to children's books. I mean, it's bad enough for librarians in general, for even adults, but for children's books, the librarians have no training, So when these people come for this training, they're like, wow, I didn't know that, I have to look at a book that way, that I can actually do a activity with children with these books and things like that. So librarians play a very important role, and they could be very terrible gatekeepers if they wanted to be. Of course, parents, if they think, no, this is not for you to read, like, I may imagine like Chandni, like some parents might say, no, you don't read this book. So there are gatekeepers of all kinds. So I feel, and I don't know, this is not your question, but I just want to push this thing a little bit, is that we need to have, platforms where right now we are all authors and writers and illustrators meeting. But I think there is a platform required where you bring together publishers, librarians, parents, so we have to hear all voices, because everybody has a reason why they do something or don't do something. And only then can we really break this wall, which is there. Otherwise, a lot of, Raakhee, there's a lot of work happening. There are lots of books, but there's lots of, writers wanting to write books about, children that are not only colored, but also, like different castes, different communities, different disability. I mean, there's so many. I mean, the whole thing on inclusion. There's so much. So there is so much that needs to become a part of children's literature. But I think that can emerge once we have a dialogue with, multiple people. Collaborate with multiple people. We don't leave it to just, a mono kind of a thing, like just looking at writers or just looking at, so I think that would help us understand the other's perspectives.
Yeah,
That's
right.
very important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, so what you're saying is that also the exchange of books, the number of books that come from the West into India, and those books are promoted and, get a lot more visibility.
Yes.
And books are written in India themselves.
Because they have the money to promote.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's face it, our publishers would love to promote, but where's the funding for that? They are barely getting, like, look, in this pandemic, they're all having such trouble, keeping the things together. It's really tough. Very tough.
Thank you for that, Tina. There was a lot of insight into how many gatekeepers there are at many levels. And I know that Rinchin also has Tulika as a publisher, and I know that Tulika absolutely loves both of you all, and you've not had problems with your publisher. But if there's anything any of you want to say more about the kind of gatekeepers you've had, otherwise we also have to now move on to audience questions. So Rinchin, Raakhee, do you want to weigh in on here about gatekeepers within publishing? Anything else that you want to say, Rinchin?
I think, of course, I mean, if you're lucky and you have publishers who are wishing, who want to push the boundaries, and but again, like, I'll go back to what we were talking about when we talk about gatekeeping. So it's also the kind of prevalent the prevalent thought and the prevalent perspectives that is there. So when we look at our society, it's also that it's not just that there is a certain way in which certain things are kept out. The fact that when we talk about caste, or we talk about sexuality, or we talk about gender in a certain way, because there is a prevalence of a certain thought, because there is what would you say, also a Brahminical control, there will be resistance to some ideas which are questioning the fabric of the society, which are talking about the injustice, which is then pointing fingers at the people who probably control the money, who control, because even simple things like what is literary and what is not. For a long time, feminist literature, Dalit literature, queer literature has a lot of times been rejected, saying it's not literary enough. Because it's the language. What is literary? Who decides? Who decides which language is the correct language? Who decides what is lyrical? Who decides what is the lyricism of a story? Or like, I think, I mean, again, like Nina said, so because my language, I write, I think, in triple translations. For example, because I grew up learning and reading and writing in English, but my context is not an English-speaking context anymore. So my characters talk another language. Probably I understand half of that language sometimes, or full. So it's translated into some language that is coherent for me, and from that it's written in English because that's a language I have a little bit control on. And or sometimes it becomes multilingual. Now you have a publisher who can work with that and who appreciates the fact that, like when we talk of Indian English, if you have someone who can appreciate that, it's fine. But otherwise it would be like, ये मजा नहीं आ रहा, या इसकी English ठीक नहीं है, या ये मैंने कई बार सुना है कि ये तो महिला लिटरेचर ठीक है पर वो साहित्यिक नहीं. So ये साहित्यिक नहीं है, literary नहीं है. Who decides? So that kind of gatekeeping happens at a very, like, it happens at a concept level. So even when you're breaking language, you have to break it in a way that it's cool. And a lot of the literature that is coming out of young people who are writing, young Adivasi writers, young Dalit writers, even women who are writing inspired from or not from a certain class, they will write and express in another way. Now that language has to be accepted and the beauty of it has to be seen. So I think that kind of gatekeeping is also something that we would probably need to think about. And of course, there are publishers who are to push that boundary, but at certain places, I think, I mean, those are things that as we evolve as publishers, as whatever, and if we have the groups that are already doing this and want to promote such work, I think the more and more we spread and the more we talk and think, like Nina was saying, I think there is a need to also engage in our own understanding of what we think is literature, like the difference between folk literature and literature, no? Or depoliticization of folk literature. So I think the more we engage, the more we talk, the more we also interrogate perceptions about the world around us. I think we'll evolve into something that more and more it'll be more and more inclusive. And that has to be the goal.
Thank you for some. Yeah, very, very much so. So actually, someone asked you, how do the books that you're writing actually reach the right children then? When you're writing, so how do the right kids, or how do we make sure that kids actually get the books that we're writing for them? So the question is that when you're writing for kids, like you said, there are so many gatekeepers and you're also translating and language is a barrier, etc. How do the right kids actually have access to your books?
So I think, every child is the right child. There are no, all kids are the right kids. But when you go through mainstream publishing, or when you have publishers who themselves, like Tulika translates in many languages, they also, I think they connect to a lot of organizations and groups that buy their books, similar for Eklavya. And also, I also make an effort to, in my work, all the groups that I'm connected with, not just my books, but books that I feel are relevant. So helping with libraries, or libraries wherever one can, or just sharing books. So that way, but that's only a small, that would be a small effort. But I think the more and more libraries in government schools, the libraries that run, or the groups that run libraries in many of the, many of those non-formal schools also. So the books go there, I think they reach the children, they reach all kinds of children, whether it's in public schools, but that there needs to be much more effort in getting the books to actually children who don't have access to books.
Yeah.
So that, and because in most places, I think even if where I live in Chhattisgarh, children rarely in those villages, children rarely get access to storybooks. There is you read literature, or you read stories that are in school books, but not beyond that, because parents, it's not a priority then to buy storybooks, because anyway education is so expensive. And government schools also, the libraries, there's not enough done to share the books that even the libraries get. So I think working there, and people, and there are initiatives that are working, but more and more work like that. I think earlier there used to be a tradition that taking books, I know that even someone like Mashweta Devi and all go to the different fairs, different melas, rallies, take books, sell them, also publish in very, publish cheap literature, 20 rupees, 30 rupees.
Yes.
And then try to get it to, and people will be, so that people are able to buy it. But libraries, through organizations, and having a lot of literature that is affordable would help books reach people. Because I would also like the books to reach the children who are being written about. No, they're not just objects of the books have to reach them also. And for me, I feel that because I am in such a setting, I can see that happen, because at least there are some places that one can get that literature to that place, but that would be small. So we have to actually, the more we all can network and try to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I meant when I meant the right kids. Kids are actually writing about, so that it is inclusive. I'm sorry.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's always like someone is being written about and someone is consuming their life.
Exactly. There's a massive imbalance with that. because books are expensive and the economy sort of requires that, because publishing needs that, especially children's publishing. So that is a very relevant thing for us to think about.
But I think Rinchin makes a really good point. As much as I love to do a Brooklyn Book Festival and a book con, because there are literally hundreds and in some cases thousands of families, right, and librarians and children, and it's glitzy and it feels great, I also recognize the importance of doing the Valley Festival, a mela at a local, at a local South Asian gathering place. We've done book fairs at our local Gurdwara, right? This is really critical in making sure that we bring the books to our families and to the children that they are about. It requires, I think there's a lot of like this unsaid, unrecognized work sometimes that needs to go on, because those are hours spent sitting at tables, selling books, getting someone to agree, like, you know what, can you just buy 500 books so we can give them away? All of that is this unsaid kind of invisible work, but it's critical. I think it's incredibly critical for books like ours, in particular, because they don't always have a giant machine behind them. Sometimes they do, but they don't always.
Absolutely.
I think this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think we can also leverage the digital medium. Print is an expensive medium, so something in a digital format can reach the masses as well. And as Rinchin has mentioned, localization is important, and localization can take place and disseminate much more easier through a digital format.
Yeah.
I think, well, I agree, but not everybody has access to the digital format. That's the thing.
Exactly.
But I want to bring nothing is small. I feel nothing is small. So many people are doing amazing kind of work. For instance, in Bombay, we have this Mumbai Mobile Creche. And they run little schools, like little places, like in small places, they have children of the construction workers, they come and learn, and these are transient populations, they come, they go, but they have a library, and they always celebrate Lit Fest. I go one to one every year and read aloud a book, to them, and then they ask questions, and then the children are so proud of their library, like, let me show you. And so each year, some 10 books are bought by the center. I mean, it's no small act. I think it's brilliant that what they do, and they do it across Mumbai. There are many centers and they invite people. I mean, nobody says no, because this is the least you can do, and it's such a pleasure, especially if it's your own book that you're going to read aloud. But I've read other people's books. I've had great fun reading other people's books, because I also get a thing to it. So I think public libraries are one places where when you talk about CSR projects, they can easily, like what Raakhee said, easily they can provide books for these public libraries, so that every child has access to these different kinds of books. So we cannot expect publishers to do all of this.
That's right.
Others have to come in as well.
Yeah, and people also need to look for the right books, right? Like when you're gifting books to kids, in families, and everyone's involved in this, choose books that are diverse, make sure that you do also help the spread of these books that you think are important, not just the author or the publisher. So another question that's come, actually, I'm going to just put two of them together. One of them asked that how do you steer clear of stereotypes when you're writing? And do you read your book out to a child before you send it to a publisher? What kind of testing do you do to make sure it's actually relevant to a kid, because you're not the age group you're writing for? So how do you make sure that,
Who's answering that?
Amna, maybe you can tell us.
I'm sorry, could you repeat? I was just reading the question in the comment section.
No, I just put a few of them together. So they say that how do you as a writer steer clear of stereotypes, right? Because we're also conditioned for some things. Like you said, Nina, a woman will be in the kitchen, right? So there are also tons of other stereotypes like that. How do you make sure that you're not falling prey to that? And then do you do some sort of testing with kids before you actually send it out to a publisher or finalize the book to make sure that they're interested in it?
Yeah. So for the first point, like for me, most of my characters in my books are women, and I have not lived those experiences. So all my experiences come from seeing women in my own life and writing them. So it was my mother, my sister, my friends. So they have sort of inspired all these characters, and it's a combination of their attributes which sort of makes up, say, a Ritu or an Aisha. And I can't do like full justice to it, but it is an effort where I try and put forth their perspective.
Yeah.
And with regards to user testing, that is something I definitely wanted to do as a designer. However, considering the subject matter, it was really difficult for me to get access directly to children and show them the book. So I'm hoping once the book is out, I'll be able to do a more thorough user testing.
Yeah.
I got a lot of users for you. Don't you call? Now we're friends. You call me. I'll gather the troops.
That would be awesome.
But I actually, I mentioned it earlier, but that is one of my favorite things to do, is to write something and then just kind of, I have a built-in audience at home, but like all of our friends, and just like give it a read and see what they think, right? Are they engaged? They have a million questions. Because they have a million questions, that's a good sign. Are they asking me for snacks? Not a good sign. You know, like it's really fun to kind of read it and see what they think. What are the words they get stuck on? What's exciting for them? So I certainly do that. But also because it's fun to see what resonates and what hits.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm impatient, so I need to know right away.
So I have a nephew now, so this was quite recent. So he's going to be like my guinea pig for my future books.
That's great. Rinchin, Nina, do you have anything to say?
I don't do any user testing because I tell other people's stories. You know, already there's someone who wants to tell their story. So I want to be as loyal to, you know, what they want to express and how they want to express it. And if they think their story has been told, then I'm happy. Then you know, if they can claim it, then anybody else will claim it. You know, it doesn't bother me so much. And in terms of how to stay away from stereotypes, I think it requires a lot of self-reflexivity. You know, that you reflect on what you are. You know, it's also your own belief system. So it's not like I will become. It is how you think. You know, so if I have biases, it will show in my work.
Yeah.
It will. And it is you know, it's only through discussion and through debate that, you know, these things are revealed to you. Of course, you do a lot of self-reflexivity as well. You know, you think, what could this mean and how would this be taken? What are the multiple, you know, meanings that can be attributed to this? But it's not something like, hey, I should avoid this or I should avoid that. I think it comes from your own, you know, reflections.
I think as you grow and when you look back at what you've written earlier also, I think you can see a change in perspective. You can sometimes reflect that, you know that probably there was something, I mean, not wrong, but yeah, this is how I thought then, but I know better now. So
yeah,
sometimes wrong also. I mean, that I thought wrongly then and I know better now. But so that's one. And no, I don't read out to children, but sometimes I check with, like, if because a lot of people who are around me inhabit my stories, so then I check with, like, if it's very heavily inspired by someone or I'm actually lifting means an incident or something that or a life that, you know, that someone had told me, then I usually check with that person that I've written this and do you like it, and because it's sort of in some way, I mean, no one would know that it's that person, but that person knows. So I usually, sometimes I've checked like that, largely in adult stories, but no, I don't teach to children, but I like to hear their responses later. So
yeah.
That,
Yeah, sorry, go on.
no, yeah, but I don't know. I just keep feeling that I think once you catch the tone of the story, I feel it's okay. I mean, you don't start out thinking that it's a children's story or whether it's an adult story. It's like the way it's told, it determines what it is. Because if you have a child character, sometimes that story is not necessarily a children's story. But, and anyway, it's flexible. So something that's long can be a story that can be enjoyed by everyone, but like A lot of times when they turned into picture books, they're condensed. So then they become like children's stories and picture books. They work both ways. But no, I haven't read out to children. I don't test it like that, but I hope it's got the...
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Keep it with me for a long time. I mean, I'm not like the kind of writer who writes and sends it out. Like, it stays with me for a year, and then like I keep going back to it. I write it, leave it, then come back to it. So by the time, and there's so many interactions with all the people that probably are in the story in between, that by the time it's like
it evolves.
वो मटका बनाने के लिए जैसे उसको पकाते हैं ना वैसे.
That's a great analogy. Well, we have about 5 minutes to go, and I just want to actually take some closing remarks from all of you about just the topic that we've been discussing, children's literature, what it should include, anything you want to say before we close out. Ameya, you're nodding, so I see you have something to say.
I think it's going to be an uphill battle for all of us here. We have to continue our efforts to write such books. We are going to face resistance, but we also at the same time going to inspire other authors to write more books like this. And once it becomes a norm that, everybody's writing similar books, it won't be such a big deal. I think it's important that I feel publishers are like the primary gatekeepers. Once they allow in more such books to be written, it would definitely pave way for, further literature.
Yeah, thank you. Raakhee?
Yeah, I say this all the time at schools, but I mean it super sincerely, which is that there are kids in your life and they have stories in their hearts, and like, please encourage them to write them and to tell them. They shouldn't wait as long as I did to write my story. I hope that we encourage them as much as we can to read a ton and to write even more.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nina?
Yeah, I think I'll second Raakhee on that. I think, it's always adults writing for children. And I think it's time we broke that. Why can't children write their own stories? Why can't we collaborate with children and become facilitators to tell the stories rather than tell on their behalf? Because then obviously, you have to use a test, you have to do all that. You don't have to do any of that. It's just, these are, kids are very smart, because if they can ask the difficult questions, they can definitely, tell some stories as well, So I think it's time to look at that place also, is to how do you collaborate with children to tell the stories and to tell you what kind of stories they want to hear. It's not necessary that they, you expect them to become writers and write stories, but at least to give us an idea of, so even here, I would have liked one kid to be, of course, Ameya is a little kid compared to others, but he's still not that kid, You need a child, you need somebody to also be on such a panel. It would have been brilliant.
Yeah, next time I'll bring a kid.
Bring a kid, because I think it's always like this, it's always, privileged people talking about underprivileged. It's adults talking about children. I think it's time we kind of held a mirror to ourselves and, did some soul searching on this.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nina. We will keep it in mind and I will get this message across.
Yeah, but quickly, I think there are some efforts like what Nina was saying. There are efforts like that. There's an organization in Bhopal called Muskan that has been publishing stories by children themselves. And I think that that's an important thing to do because it also brings in many perspectives. So it also breaks the hierarchy of so while there is an importance for adults to write for children, there's also for children or children for adults, whoever would like to read it. And it's also a certain amount of seriousness that should be attached to that. For a long time, I think it is that कि वो चलो मतलब वो बच्चों ने कहानी लिखी वो मेले में बनी वो ऐसे ही अपन ने बांट दी. That's also there, but there is a potential in those stories because they do something. They speak to children. They speak to their peers. A child talking about his or her first day in school or how she felt humiliated or even very small things which probably unless you're very connected to your inner child, it gets diluted when you write it as an adult. And because also the experiences will be so different. So honing that, nurturing it, and giving it a seriousness, like teaching it as a proper book, you know, like this, like my book or some Nina's book, and then there is, you know, Paptu's book. And there are stories like that, and I think sometimes, and it also brings out like how children deal with their everyday life. So that's I think it's an important thing to do, and we need to encourage more people to write, because the more stories they hear about themselves, you get the reformation that yes, you can also write. Your story is worth writing. Like, because I think all through this panel we've been saying how underrepresented we felt in a very English sort of like the kind of stories, even as a queer person or different, we felt underrepresented, and we took so much time to write. But in India, like, so when you think of children that are so in the margins, for them to think that, you know, that a book by them is a book worth reading, not just for themselves, but for others also.
Yes.
So that, and effort has to be put. It has to be done with seriousness and a lot of sincerity. And people have to accept it in literature.
Absolutely.
Not just as like a bachcha kuch panna hai, but as literature.
Yeah. Thank you so much. These have been great points. And I just want to end by saying that we have like a minute maximum to go. I just want to end by saying that to everyone listening, we need to make an effort as people who are not writing, but to pick out the right kind of books, to promote the right kind of books ourselves, so that publishers are also, you know, nudged into publishing those books and accepting topics that are offbeat. And next time we will have a child talking about children's literature for sure. But thank you all for joining us so much. It's been such an enriching conversation and so many different perspectives. So thank you, and we will stay in touch.
Thank you, Shranya. Thank you, Bilal.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was so
Lovely
great.
meeting you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shranya.
Thank you, participants.
Really well
Bye.
done. Bye, everybody.
Bye.